All right, so I'm Jon Erwin, and I'm a writer, producer, director, creative director, project manager, depending on the kind of project and the needs for it. But the main thing I try to focus on really is bringing stories to life and storytelling, and that can mean everything from things in the creative marketing world, like more promo and traditional marketing campaigns, to digital series, to documentaries, to social content, and even a few podcasts in the mix as well. But I just really like to do that sort of like creative puzzle and put together of, story you want to tell from a person or a brand, the target audience, and then trying to find a relatable, personable way into that conversation is one of those kind of, I just like always gravitate towards those sort of problems to solve. And outside of work, I'm a dad of two girls, and I have like ADHD habits on repeat between gardening and cooking and baking and that sort of stuff. So I have a lot of outside the work creative juices flowing too.
Welcome to Scratch Claw Push, a podcast about artists clawing out a place for themselves in the world. I'm Billy Jo Cones.
And I'm Brendan Duke. Let's go. Looking at you're going through your website, yeah, you're kind of like all over the place with your media endeavors. You got interviews, you got YouTube series, and it's just the subject matter is pretty broad. So you're just one of those guys that just felt like anything that catches your interest is like, let's just go dive into that.
Kind of, yeah. And I think in hindsight, now that I'm like have more perspective on my career and myself, I feel like, not to front load with my ADHD stuff, but like it's also a superpower in a way where like I just have so many interests and I have such like an appetite to learn in general that I would love to learn a little bit about a lot and dive into each different one. And I think it helps when I'm trying to go then write scripts or produce content for Barbie or History Channel, and I could be able to bounce between those mindsets and worlds that you have to kind of like live in and kind of surround yourself with in a way to really get those voices right. It kind of just comes with, I think, having too many passions in a way. So I'm not one of those people who likes to know everything about a couple things. I'm more like, give me the surface level Cliff Notes version about a lot. And probably helps to be able to bounce around brands and stories like that.
I heard. I'm sorry. I just said like an old martial arts teacher I follow is coined the term, being a specialist at being a generalist. And I feel like that's kind of what your situation, because I feel like I'm very much the same way. It's just like, oh, what's that? That's cool. Let's go looking at that. But I mean, you can also get that's also a pathway to getting into all kinds of fun stuff.
That's an interesting way to think about it, a specialist at being a journalist. And I think it's something you guys probably hit as well. In the creative field, you kind of always have to, I feel like you have to be nimble in a way where, something that comes across your plate that you want to do, you're not going to say no to just because you haven't done that exact thing in that exact role and that exact tone for that exact client before. So I kind of just will always say yes, and if I fail, then I'll be honest about it and say, hey, then move on, hire some, we can go our separate ways if we need to, but luckily it doesn't happen very much. So
I definitely know people who will let that stop them for sure. There are people who are just like, oh, I'm not comfortable with that, I don't have the expertise for that. So I think that isn't something that necessarily everybody does. Do you think that is also from your just curiosity and general, you were saying how your ADHD kind of makes you go, oh, good with this and oh, with that. And, I'm a very curious person. So, but there's something where do you think that part of you comes from that is not only curious, but also willing to dive in, even if you don't know if you'll succeed?
It's a good question. I think there's part of me that comes from desperation, and I come from a very humble background where I was taught to be thankful for everything you have, and you have to be scrappy, and you show up and put in a hard day's work, and you get, what you put in out of it. And I think that's a part of it. as well of like just my upbringing, where like I'll do whatever I need to do to kind of keep things moving and progressing. And hand in hand, I think too, this is just like sparks a lot of like introspective thoughts of I don't like being bored, and I don't mind challenging myself, I think in some ways too, of seeing if I can write this thing that I've never written before, or trying to adapt. Barbie was such like a stretch project of a brand for me in some ways, and I didn't do a lot of work with them, but it's just so much fun to like try to write in such a different tone and voice, and how pithy you have to be and playful, and those sorts of things. Like I love that creative challenge that kind of the breadth of content has thrown at me so far.
So what was your general, because I kind of know this, but for our audience, like what was your general background, or where did you kind of come into all this from? Like, did you start when you were younger with a certain type of creativity and then go into sort of the advertising production creative world, or, what was your journey?
My journey. Well, I think, yeah, it's like, how do you describe your life in a succinct way? In hindsight, I was definitely one of those kids that loved to make. I do most of my work in the video space, some social and a little bit of podcast, mostly in the video space, and that's where I cut my teeth at least. And I was definitely one of those kids that like turned any school project possible into a video project. Like my friends are making stop motion animation Lego movies. It's probably terrible if we ever found them, but as a kid for science projects, or would go out and make sketches to recreate and make fun of our like books we had to read in English class. Like anything we could do to kind of just be goofy and put it on tape and try something different, we were doing it, as opposed to like, let's go write a paper. Like that wasn't it wasn't my vibe necessarily. So I think that probably is where it all started. But in terms of like my career and jobs and work, I started in actually broadcasting and political science, where I majored in particular navigating like local news and sports production is what I thought I wanted to do. And then I realized very quickly I'm not a small town person. Like I've lived in Indianapolis and New York City. That's it. That's as small as I get is Indianapolis. So in a lot of the local news and sports reporting jobs are small town startup, like where you start off. And so I just realized the lifestyle wasn't for me. So I was kind of pivoted to New York and used kind of the production, storytelling, writing chops you get from like journalism, then into creative marketing, and especially in the early on, especially focused on the digital and social space, because that's kind of where they needed those one-man band types of creatives and storytellers there, because back then it's like the early days of YouTube, right? Budgets were tiny for digital. No one knew what you're doing on social. You're kind of making it up as you go along, and hopefully you stumble on something good. So you're kind of they're looking to hire people that could write and shoot and edit and do some graphics and just kind of make content as like test dummies in a way for this new spot. So that's kind of how I stumbled into it, and then just fell in love with like the creativity you have in digital and social spaces that you may not have on like, traditional linear promos or on air TV spots and things like that, where you have 30 seconds constrained, you have a lot of viewer expectations, and now third screens popping up. Like in digital and social, I just felt like there's so much more freedom and flexibility with what you could do and how you could pull people in and that. So kind of mostly stayed in that digital social space for most of my work.
Yeah. So let me bring it back though. So when you're in that space, I worked very peripherally to advertising, so I got to see some of it. And what I saw are a lot of creatives who were sort of jaded, disgruntled, because they were creating, they'd have ideas, people give them parameters, and you have these amazing ideas, and the client goes, no, not that. That doesn't fit our brand voice. No, not that. And so you can get really, really sad really fast, because all your amazing ideas that might be really cool get shot down. And so the creatives that I saw thrive were the ones that went and wrote a book on the side, or, did a photography project on the side, and really invested in their own work aside from, and that's hard because you might be working 60, 80 hours a week some weeks. But the ones that I thought really held it together and were able to keep going in that realm were the ones that kind of said, okay, besides having work-life balance and saying no to some mandatory company outings, they also, pursued other things outside of that. And that's something that one of our first guests, Dan Nelkin, talks a lot about, is people creating outside of what they're creating for clients. So how have you done that for yourself? And what kinds of things have you, because, when you're a production company also, you can do things under the umbrella of your company, but you can pitch easier because you're a company and not just a person, right? So I'm just curious how that has manifested for you, what kinds of things you've found to do that have helped you get past that. Oh, I'm just creating for the client and my creativity is sort of dying in the corner over here.
Yeah, that's another good one. And I think for me, that's something I'm crossing right now and coming up against literally right now at this moment in my life too. Because for so long I was on staff at NBC with Sci-Fi in particular for 10 years or something like that. So to your point, there wasn't as much time and or flexibility because the projects I worked on were anything I did, even the video sphere, were owned by NBC unless I got written approval for them. So it just made it harder and less necessary. I luckily stumbled upon a job that was just super creative, and we were part of like an internal creative studio where our whole job was to pitch ideas and pitch content and come up with digital shows. And so I got to do, to be honest, like my dream job for a few years. And so I was like, I'm feeling fulfilled. I got to cover comics and like the height of Marvel movies and Star Wars. I'm a massive nerd, and I use that word in like a loving, embracing, all my fellow nerds sort of way. And I got to produce content about that stuff at like the peak of it. So at that point in my career, I felt very fulfilled, and I love the cat, by the way. I felt very fulfilled. I didn't need that. But now, and this is nothing against my work I do with my clients. I love the work I do, but I am now feeling that need to find something else for myself that is not deadline driven, that does not have someone else's parameters on it. And so I started writing a kid's book. I have no idea if it's going to go anywhere, and it's fine if it doesn't. I'm totally fine with that just being some pages in my Google Drive and some sketches in a notebook. But I started writing a kid's book because my kid inspired me, and going through therapy and working through things, it kind of just sparked a conversation with myself. And so I'm like, let's do it. I'm just going to keep going on the rabbit hole because it feels good. So that's kind of literally finding those sort of creative outlets outside of work is something I'm going through like right now and in my career in this stage, to be honest.
I'm curious just with your, again, like the broad swath of stuff that you've gotten into, how do you, I'd say, I mean, like, I guess, what is the filtering process, if there is one, about what, where do you see like a certain subject or a certain thing, and then what is it that makes you pull the trigger, says, okay, I'm going to lean into this particular thing, whether it's like, oh, let's do a show about like ancient recipes for History Channel or ancient workouts. Like, what is the thing? Is it just kind of like a feeling you get, like, okay, I really want to go deep dive over here? Or is it more of like, okay, we have the resources, personnel, yada, 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 to this? Or is it both? Like what, so how do you hone in on a particular project?
Yeah, I compliment you guys on your questions. A lot of like thinking about my own processes, my own like sort of way of thinking about things. For me, it is very much a feeling. It is a feeling. But it's also, I think it's mostly a feeling of trust that I have. Like if my clients trust in me and I trust in them in both ways, of like they trust in me to be able to bring their idea to life with a little bit of freedom. And what I mean by that is kind of like pitch ideas. Just because you put them on paper, you want the A, B, and C, doesn't mean you actually want A, B, and C. It may mean you want D, E, and F. You just don't know that because you're taking your goals and trying to think about them as deliverable first, instead of going back to like the start of the process, like what are our goals, what are our audience here? And if I have the trust and freedom to like pitch a different way in, or a different way of thinking about it, or a different series or something like that, then I think those are the projects I'm drawn to. If like, can I own a little bit of something? Can I have some ownership and freedom? And so I'm not just, a executing per someone's to-do list and per their parameters, which I'm happy to do. Some projects it's nice to just like turn the brain off and chug through, but most of them, if I'm really going to dive in, I kind of want that sort of freedom to own part of the process, whether it be the creative part or the producing elements, either one.
So let me just piggyback off that and ask, so in regards to the ancient recipes one, because I find that super interesting being a foodie and a former restaurant person myself, where did the idea for that come from? And what was that yours? The whole idea for it? Or, yeah, I'm just really curious about that.
Yeah, that one was not my idea.
Okay.
History came to me with an idea. Basically, it was like a short blurb log line of sorts about it, and an idea of what they wanted to do, which was food and history, combine it together. And in particular, wanted to do it in the YouTube space first, with eyes for like, how do we translate this YouTube show to on air at some point? And that's kind of like the trajectory and sandbox I was given in. But it was created by them. The idea of it was, and then we worked together. And they knew that from my time at Sci-Fi, I'd spun up and been pivotal kind of in their YouTube and Instagram strategy and creative. And so they knew that's kind of was my wheelhouse of like YouTube digital series that can pick up an audience, find an audience, can be unique. And so they trusted me. I'd worked with some of them previously, but they trusted me to kind of take it from that one paragraph log line all the way through to execution. And that meant everything from like the internal pitch decks you need to put together to get people internally on board and psyched up, and the marketing team jazzed to put some like oomph behind it, all the way from breaking the stories and working with our like awesome host Sola to find out what recipes and what cultures we want in time periods we wanted to focus on, to writing them and researching and set deck and all that jazz. So kind of granted, I didn't do all those pieces, right? Like that's not my job, but coordinating, making sure it all tied together, it was cohesive and like all on the same page. So that way we brought that like that original vision to life. And I bet if we went back and looked at it, it'd be very different from where it started. But that's kind of the best part of, picking up a little bit of piece from Sola, a little bit of piece from the internal history team and our production company, who is awesome. And they're in the food space too. They brought a ton of kind of other ways of thinking about how we shoot the show to the table too, which I think really helped the look of it and just the feel of it all. Because what people see on screen, it's actually almost all fake. Kitchen. There's a little bit in the back that's like a real built-in kitchen, but the rest of it's just there brought in from the side. So
I saw a stage show once where a woman cooked an entire fish during the show, and it was obviously not a real kitchen. So it was it's funny how that happens. Well, so if that one wasn't yours, so tell us more a little bit about like some of the ideas that you have had that you've gotten produced, how those got brought to life, and I would also love to hear a little bit about how you have to advocate for your own ideas in that circumstance, or how you have to interpret sometimes for clients who may not have, I don't know, my agents always say that the clients don't have much of an imagination, so we have to do it for them. So I'm curious if you've had any experience with that as well. Sorry, that was a lot to throw at you.
Yes, I have experience with that, because I couldn't agree more. And it's no fault of theirs either. Like, right, there's a reason why they're hiring me or us and people like this to bring it to life, is because they're not hiring us just to execute and be a robot executing what's on paper. Some of the ideas that I've come up with, original ones for myself that I've gotten greenlit, a lot of them came from my days with Sci-Fi. And in particular, we did a kind of internal creative studio startup that kind of created what E-News was to E for Sci-Fi, called Sci-Fi Wire. It's like genre nerdy news, entertainment content there. And that was just like, my whole job was, like I mentioned before, coming up with creative ideas. So we did, my favorite ones was one, we did a retro gaming comedy based talk show. I guess you could call it a talk show, but basically it's like we got 3 comedians in a room, decked out the set to look like a like a vomit of 90s decorations in a bedroom. Like you had lava lamps, you had trolls, you had Dare posters, all that jazz. And then you just got them to play retro video games. It was like Mall Madness. It was Pretty Pretty Princess, and Pogs, I think, was one of them. And we just kind of let the conversation flow. We put in some like 90s snacks. We had some like topics and games we played with them to kind of facilitate that sort of vintage, nostalgic, look back sort of conversations, and let them riff off each other. And that one was so much fun to just kind of see where their minds went, which were sometimes inappropriate or sometimes, push the boundaries, but in a good way. That one was really fun. And then a couple other ones that I'm like most proud of too are I was able to write, produce, direct one documentary and then executive produce another documentary, both in the comic space. And I'm a huge comics guy. And one of them was on the story of Image Comics from the 90s, which was like a group of 5, 6, 7, I forget me off the top of the head, basically the top selling Marvel artists at the time is when comic books were selling millions of copies. So they were like rock stars. Like literally Eazy-E was pulling up to some of their comic book releases in LA and like lines out around the block. And so telling the story of how they kind of like said, screw you to Marvel and started their own thing, but all based because of creators' rights and the lack of creators' rights that they're having over the characters they're creating. So that was awesome to be able to tell their story, and something that I was fanboying out, being able to talk to them about it too, these artists and creators. And then the second documentary is focused on one of them, Todd McFarlane, who's creator of Spawn and has his own now toy like empire, basically. And so telling his story of kind of, the roller coaster hardships, very much creative process based, about what he had to go through to kind of create his own toy company, also create his own Spawn empire, his own comics company, and all of that. So, which is really inspiring, and just, it's really cool to be able to see that come to life as well. Those are like two of my most proud projects, and all kind of, granted, they're not all just my idea, right? It still is a collaborative one, but very much like a big part of the genesis of those projects for sure.
That's super cool. I noticed that when I was looking through your website that you, I love that you right away. I saw you'd kind of picked up on two of my favorites. You got The Dark Knight Returns, and then you went after Todd McFarlane, who I was a big fan of the Spawn comic when it first came on. And I remember HBO briefly had a show where they had animated it. And it was actually pretty cool. They didn't quite stick the landing on the movie. I'm still hoping one day they'll circle back around to that. But I mean, still, like it's that was like you've done like I noticed on your website, you kind of, one of the things that you highlighted is like when you did with your work for Sci-Fi, you really helped them kind of bump up the engagement, especially through their social. What are some of the things you learned during that process and that you continue to use today? Like as far as, because like nowadays it's all about getting the eyes, getting the clicks. And it's just like when you're out there against a world full of competition from every which way, what are the tricks that you've learned through all this stuff to kind of like help cut through the noise?
Yes, that's like another good one. For what we did back then with Sci-Fi Wire, and pulling from what I learned, but the things that usually worked were, one, just trying out any idea that felt right. Like if you get to know your brand good enough and what you want to do, and like it kind of going back to like the puzzle pieces of like what message you want to tell, what's your target audience, and gut instinct of like what content may feel right, and trying it. Because in social especially, it's like if it doesn't do well, okay, it's one graphic. Like we made a bad graphic. Who cares? Right? Especially on like Instagram, where it's more, every day is different. And so there's a lot of trial and error, not going to lie, a lot of trial and error. And then doubling down once we started to see stuff perform, and quickly, nimbly being able to create content in that same vein and pivot to that way. So we luckily had a team that was super nimble. We met every day, every morning. We started it off with a convo about what did well, what didn't do well, what are we going to do? and dove into that. And it was short. It was like 20 minutes. You didn't need to go deep into it, but how can we every day change something to make it a little bit better? And just eventually over time, it kind of got to be a well-oiled machine, both I think creatively and strategically. And then I think the other part too is putting that brand puzzle piece or the puzzle together of finding ways to insert the brand's messages into like the larger zeitgeist. Those are the ones I think took off the most, is when we were able to, like, our goal eventually was to promote sci-fi shows and movies, but we were talking about at that time Star Wars or Batman or something else, and be able to, like, in an organic way that doesn't turn people off, still bring in the Mad Max movie marathon for sci-fi or something else like that, while Mad Max is in the zeitgeist. Like, that's where also we kind of found a sweet spot of content. Like, where do we and how do we try to pull those sort of brand messages into the larger conversation? And that's helpful. Like, that's kind of what I do with anybody and everybody, is like, how do you make your brand message digestible and relatable for someone that, may not know who you are, or may not even care who you are, but they care about this one little bit of a thing that you do or you bring to the table, that they could relate to.
I'm sure that's where the nerd cred really, you can bring it home, because as any good
True.
nerd, you can always find a way to get back to your favorite subject of choice. So it's kind of, go out there and okay, and on sci-fi, oh, by the way, we're doing the Mad Max, thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. It's like, part of it is just living in that world. Like, I lived in it naturally. Like, that was my jam before. And part of it is like just living in this space of that world. I can't tell you how many Franks and recipes, even how many historical cookbooks I've read. A lot of them didn't go anywhere, right? We didn't do a recipe from them or that era, or maybe we did, but it was part of one recipe, or I read a chapter just to try to pull like one ingredient to make sure we had the right type of, I can't remember at this point, but like right type of greens involved. But it's just like living in this space, digesting in this space. So that way it's, easier to kind of just trust your gut once you get to like a decision-making point. I think you hit it on the head there.
So I want to ask you, so it sounds like with all this, you were talking about the sort of iteration portion of just doing something, and that social media allows you to do that in a way that like TV advertising doesn't, right? Because that costs so much more money, right? So you can just create content, keep putting it out, see what works. From all of that experience that you have in that arena, I think what would be interesting for our listeners, who are from all different creative backgrounds, everybody comes to their creativity with a different set of skills, and, we have people who write, or we have people who are actors, or we have people who are doing all sorts of different things. What would you say to them? What would you tell them is the biggest mistake that they could make in trying to promote their work on social media?
I'm probably not a good person to ask this question to be honest.
Why do you say that?
I am the worst self-promoter out there. If you go to my Instagram, it's my kids in my life. Like, it's a little bit of work. That's a place that I could use someone to chime in and tell me how to be better and how to do it in a way that's humble and organic and doesn't feel, as the kids say, I guess, cringy now, or cringe.
Cringe.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
We don't need the wide anymore. We've done away with it.
Just cringe. I'm not very good at that part. I struggle with that. And I think a lot of my work and things come from people I know or have worked with, and people I keep in contact with. So I guess my angle into it is the other side. I keep in contact with a lot of different people. One, because I like friends in the industry, and I like seeing what other people are doing and hearing like what they're up to and being creatively inspired by them. And even has nothing to do with video or anything in my sphere. I don't do a good job of the social promotion at all.
Well, maybe not for yourself, but I would hazard a guess that you do have something that you've learned from all of the creation, that that just doing it over and over again, you get a sense of like, this content performs well, this just bombed, or maybe even the type of I don't know, like the type of anything really, because I think like the more you put it out there, the easier it becomes. And what you said before really resonated with me, because I used to do social media marketing for small arts organizations, and what I thought the people in charge didn't understand, being older and not of the social media generations, is they thought of it almost like it was a permanent thing. They really were worried about doing it exactly right, and not what you were saying, which is just do it, just try it, just throw it up there, right?
Yeah.
Like if you screwed up, they'd be like, oh, we need to issue a retraction, like it was like like it was a news report. And I was like, no, you just say, hey, my bad, I'm sorry, I tagged the wrong person, we got you next week. And and you make light of it. It's very casual and friendly, right?
Yeah. And hearing this is, I think there's what you're kind of moving towards too, is a kind of like a self-awareness, and maybe that's what I've helped brands develop, is a little bit of that, and maybe that's where it comes from. And it's like feels natural to, when you're saying you make a mistake or you do something sloppy or whatever it is, you don't fact check to the 99th percentile, or someone, there's always going to be someone that knows a little bit more than you about something. It's impossible to be the foremost expert in it. Like at this day and age, that it's okay to be like, my bad, like raise your hand, and you can turn it into a funny thing to do. And I think like so many brands, especially like in the comedy space, like a Wendy's or a Taco Bell, do a really good job, like those bigger fast food brands in that space, of being super self-aware with a comedy angle into it. And not everybody needs to have a comedic angle to being self-aware, but you can be, I think, very self-aware and kind of those sort of changes. And yeah, I think being brave about posting stuff should be it. Just especially in the social space, there's nothing not worth trying unless it's going to offend somebody. Besides those things, like why not?
And nowadays, it's like there's become a thing, like in the last few years, that people always talk about, having a brand story, or or for lack of a better term, like a personality. Like you were talking, like certain brands are very good. Like you look online and you start to kind of you almost get like a sense of the brand through how they interact with the public. And do you start to develop like having been a part of these, do you start to develop like certain instincts about how you can hone in on that maybe better as you go from like one client to another, and you kind of say, okay, like here's going to be the thing that kind of, really helping other people put their best foot forward?
Yes. And I have done a little bit of this work with Sci-Fi and NBC Sports, and like social voice brand guidelines, and how do you talk, and how do you, create a personality when you're not as distinct as like a Wendy's or a Taco Bell, where you're like super fun and like jokey and kind of provocative, because that's not everybody's. Shouldn't be every brand's cup of tea. And it is for me, my process is diving into their competitor set of like who else creates stuff in this, and then what's going to differentiate those brands from everybody else. And like and it can be slight. It can be like, hey, we're uplifting. In sports world, we're going to be the uplifting voice. We're going to be the one that does not trash on people. We don't go and point out all the flaws. We don't go and replay 100 times this guy flubbing it or whatever it is, because there's going to be 500 other competitors doing that. We're going to be the ones that go and highlight the stories that give positive feel, whatever that sort of like little niche of space. Like that to me is, my process is diving into like the competitive set on the platforms that they would give me, and then trying to figure out, okay, what's not being served at, what is what's oversaturated in that market. And a lot of people, I think the tendency in some ways is to double down on what's working, right? It's like, oh, okay, we have blooper reels working. Let's do 500 more blooper reels because we got to get involved in that trend. And there's something to be said about that. But there's something for on a more macro level, like a longer term level, that's pull it back a little bit and like, what are we doing when this trend dies? Because it will next week, right? Like, what is the actual long-term benefit of this? Because it could be detrimental to your brand. Are you trashing on a client? Are you trashing on a potential new partner? Are you, facilitating the conversations you want to? But it's very much, making sure you know the competitive space of what's happening. And also like point inspiration. It's not always like, oh, I don't want to do that. It's like, oh, I want that. I want a little bit of this. I want a little bit of this pie. And put it all together for these brands.
That's an interesting topic because we've talked before with guests about specificity in art and how important it is. But often it's like it's like how it's easier sometimes to play really broad characters, right? It's easier to play a character who's really unlike you, but it's really hard to play someone who's just like 10% different than you because you have to be so specific then about what things are different. And you're kind of talking about that in regards to brands. And I wonder kind of how that would work with some of our listeners or our guests where, just know it's that inner awareness of like, this is who I am. And this is how, because most artists don't think about how they position themselves in the industry or what who their competition is and how they can stand out from their competition. But I do wonder, like, if they thought a little bit more about the specificity of well, okay, so I'm always up against these two other people for these roles. We're the people who get in front of people for these roles. Now, how can I not try to be them, but how can I be that 10% different than them? And it can be subtle, right? Because that's what I'm hearing you say, is that it can be subtle sometimes.
Yeah, it can be subtle. And if it's subtle, it just may take more time for people to recognize the differences because it is 10% different, right? So like it's only 10% different. It may take, in your case, like what you're saying, 4 auditions for that same sort of casting agency to recognize, oh, this is her little bit of niche here, his little bit of niche here. And I think for brands, that's it as well. It's like, especially in the social space, like you're mentioning, you can iterate and change, but there still takes time for like brand sentiment and to change and people's view of you as a brand to change. It still takes a little bit more time there. And something you hit on too is something I bring up and like I try to keep in my writing. I have it up on my wall in a way, and it's written incorrectly. But in terms of like specificity, to me, is something that I'll tell everybody in terms of like writing a brand or storytelling is the more specific you get, the more universal you get, right? In that way. And I think it's what you're talking about, where if like you give a very specific, relatable example of something, or you give a very specific, relatable, you work through a scene in a very specific, relatable way, and you change one thing that everybody can relate to, then it makes it actually more universal because more people see that quirk or see that line or that sort of fact and things dropped in there. It's something to kind of just consider.
Yeah.
The paradox of specificity. On one hand, it's like you're getting narrow in your focus, but it kind of, in a strange way, it kind of broadens the appeal.
Well, and
exactly.
It goes back to, the specificity thing, especially with brand discussions, that, a good brand repels as many people as it attracts, right? So you're trying to find your nerdy tribe, right? Like you're trying to speak to them. Like the other day I was I have this new coaching thing I'm doing, and I was talking to these people, and I'm using Lord of the Rings as an example. And like all of a sudden I see like people leaning forward and nodding, and I'm like, oh, she said Mordor. I get it. Like, I'm like, okay, your goal is Mordor. And like, you have to stop at Rivendell and da-da-da along the way. And they're like, oh my God, you're speaking my language. Thank you. And I was like, but then I had another session later and I was like, Lord of the Rings. And they're like, And so like, got to know your audience and who you're talking to and how to talk to them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love it too, is like, because that can apply to to any creative field. Like if you're doing, I don't know, I just keep thinking about my children's book because that's kind of my creative side project that gets me jazzed anymore. But like, even if you like allude to it in the background of the art, or like one little bit of a line makes a specific drop in, all of a sudden it mentions Mordor, right? Or it has like the Sauron eye for some reason. Not that a kid's book would, but you get what I'm saying? Of like that little bitty thing of a drop or a hint or an Easter egg automatically makes it more relatable for people and just like open to hear your story at that point.
Right. But you think about like when we were kids and we watched like the original Looney Tunes that were on all the time, all the, and those came out in what, the 30s, 40s? And so they were alluding to, they had all these references to like famous people from Hollywood's golden era for the adults. And we have no idea who those people are. We're like, I don't know who that is. It's just funny. It's a funny cartoon. And then I remember like flash forward to my adolescence and watching, it was the one with the shark dog. Was it Rocko's Modern Life or was it a different one? I think it was a different one. Eek the Cat. And Eek the Cat, one episode, they were like totally referencing A Clockwork Orange. And I'm watching this and I'm in high school and I just happened to have heard about Clockwork Orange even though I hadn't seen it yet. And I was like, I know what they're doing. And like they referenced Shaft at one point, and it's like kids would have no idea. But the adults who are watching with their kids are going to know and are going to connect. So with your kids' book, where did you, and you don't have to tell us like the whole thing if you're trying to like keep it, but like where did you get your idea for your kids' book? I'm just curious.
Yeah. That came from, to be honest, it came from a therapy session for myself and my therapist talking through kind of my internal conversations. And my youngest child is a very emotive child. She has like a movement disorder that kind of makes interpreting big emotions. She's 4, so she's like in the middle of toddler phases, but it makes her movement disorder makes interpreting these big emotions even harder, I think, for her, and more difficult. And so she struggles with, transition moments and struggles with any time where she doesn't really get what she wants in times. And that, for me, makes it hard as a parent. And if like trying to get them ready for the morning and at nighttime for bed and all those sort of things just makes it that much more difficult. And so it just started from that sort of like space of a challenge, but then also working through of like, hey, there is so much that she has taught me through this. And just like totally changes. She's one of those like in a minute, how she looks at you or how she says something or the way she runs out of her bedroom in the morning to give you a hug, like totally can change your demeanor. And just like me realizing how much I had learned from her instead of just focusing on how difficult like my taskmaster trying to get the stuff done for the night so they're clean and safe and well fed and that stuff, like switching that perspective on what else like we have shared and how much she has helped me grow and see different things I didn't even think about and be able to kind of pivot to better mental spaces quicker because of her. And I didn't realize that until kind of like working through it with my therapist, and they started to poke and prod and point things out. And so then it's just like, hey, I need to write this down. It's too much. And it started to come out in, sometimes I write poems, sometimes I just journal. And this one just came out in like a kid's book. And I just was seeing it very visually. And so I just started going with it, and it just flowed. And I'm like, I'm one of those people, if I get going, I don't want to stop. Sometimes it takes a lot to start, but like, I don't want to stop. Like, shut the door, lock me in here. I'm writing, or I'm producing, I'm working through something. And that's the way it was with this. I just kept writing for like an hour until it just was there.
That's your hyper focus kicking in right there, right?
Yeah, my flow state, hyper focus, all that jazz.
So something just occurred to me as you were talking that I'd never really thought of before, but like when you were talking about like what you've learned from your daughter or daughters, I guess, that they say that the best way to really internalize something that you've learned and to really make sure you've learned it is to teach it to somebody else. And I've never thought about this before, but like when you are being a parent, you're having to teach your kids just general how to be a human stuff. And so I wonder and this is just, I don't have kids, I have a cat, but like the whole process of being a parent then is kind of like relearning or internalizing all these things about being human that is just really interesting to me. I never thought about that before.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever been so introspective as to until I became a dad, and then I started to think about, like, to your point, they pick up on everything more than you even know, before you even know, earlier than you even know, and it's just good, bad, or otherwise. And so yeah, it has made me much more of an introspective person, and it's I wouldn't have it any other way.
Well, there's just so many things that kids we take for granted because they just, we've forgotten when we learned about them when we were 2 or 4 or 5. And now all of a sudden we're having to explain, oh, well, why is that? And maybe we've forgotten even why something is the way it is that we have to explain. So it's just interesting to me.
And they don't know nuance, right? They don't get sarcasm. They don't, those things that we take for granted. Like, to your point, we take for granted, that are just like, I know when my wife's being sarcastic with me, but they don't. And that's the sort of stuff like we've had to relearn ourselves. Like, hey, we need them to see that you are just joking with me. Because I know, but they don't know. Or like, if we do have an argument and disagreement, which happens, and we've made a point, and I don't want to get this into like parent preaching part, but like made a point of, before they go to bed, make sure that they see we're going to be reconciled. We know we will get to that point, and we don't have to reconcile in that moment, but we want to show them that we're okay, because we know that, because they're not able to, process and all of that. So it does just make me rethink what they're learning, how we learned it, how to teach them all these sort of like nuances of being a human being in the world.
So, just going off of that too, what do you think are the hardest parts about, or I don't know. I don't know where I was trying to go with that. I had a thought. Anyway,
I'm just
Brandon?
wondering, is like have having to communicate with children like on a regular basis, is that kind of helped your own kind of communication process, like out in the workplace, especially as you're sometimes maybe having to pitch stuff to somebody who might not be a creative and doesn't get it and doesn't know how they're gonna to get, to understand how this maybe off the wall idea is going to help them. And like, if you, that has the parenting process maybe helped you get a little better at, kind of, pitching, or, maybe getting across some ideas that might not always be kind of like apparent on the surface. Like, you might know they're great, but maybe the other person kind of hasn't got there, and you have to get them there.
I'm not sure if it's helped in that way specifically, but I do think it's helped in terms of like adding some more like arrows to my creative quiver to pull from, for like working with clients like a Barbie, or I've done some local nonprofit work in the education space, and specifically like schools that are elementary schools and things. And so stuff like that, it's like, oh, I'm already a parent. My kids play in this space. I consume and see and read all this sort of parenting content that's out there. So like being in that target audience already, it just like adds another couple arrows to my quiver I can pull from. So it's less of, we talked about previously, like I need to dive in, get the competitive set, research and digest all this stuff. I don't have to do that as much for those sorts of clients. So I'm not sure if it's helped like the pitching process per se, but it's definitely helped in sort of just like giving me more to pull from creatively from throughout the world. I think it's definitely helped in that way. And also like finding ways to pull in. I try to drop in little, whether it be like parenting jokes or nerdy jokes or things like that into like a lot of what I do. Just if it gets cut, it gets cut. Like it's fine. But like, I don't know, there's so many Ancient Recipes episodes where I probably didn't make the final cut, but Sol and I would drop in like a random kind of nerdy reference because she enjoys that sort of stuff. And so just like in terms of that, it's like it gives me some more creative ammo to have in my tank to kind of throw around if I need it.
Just going off of that, it's like you even more than find your people, and those people are so delighted, I think, when they see a reference in something that's completely unrelated, that they're like, oh, these people are my people, right? Like, I follow a creator account on Instagram, and they do animations, and they're very, very weird, right? They're very trippy and weird, and they're always to music. And so it's like, I already know, like, they like a lot of the same music I do. And then one day I saw they had these little TVs in the background of this little scene they had going on. So it wasn't the direct focus, but on those TVs was a TV show from public television in Wisconsin that I watched as a kid in school. And I was like, oh my God, that's that. And I messaged them privately and was like, oh my God, how do you know about this TV show? And I was like, I already knew you guys were my people, but now you're really my people. So I feel like you end up getting like the fans when you have a reference to something that is, it doesn't detract from the main thing, but just enough pulls those people in who are aware. Yeah.
Yeah. Especially in like nostalgia, excuse me. Especially nostalgia for our like generations in particular, like because it's such a, I can't help but want to go there in terms of like making me remember what it was like to be a kid and like a lot less responsibilities and the stuff I was into at that point, and like dropping in a little hint of that throughout it is always fun. And whether it be from like a brand's perspective, like inserting yourself, it can be into the zeitgeist of like something you didn't expect because it's there. Yeah, I think pulling from those like fun little nuanced moments definitely to find your audience. And also like in the social digital space, I think it comes up with thoughts again of it doesn't have to be for everybody in those, because it's so transactional. It's so just if a churn at some point. It's like, sure, you can have one sports related post that has like a Lord of the Rings reference into it. Like, you know, if there's someone gets blocked at the rim for basketball and then there's a Gandalf, you shall not pass in here. Like, there you go. And you found like your niche for a second. And yeah, I think it makes it even more fun, right? Because then people are like, oh, to your point, I found my people, found my audience. And even if they don't get it, then they just move on, right? They scroll through or they move on to the next thing. It doesn't matter to them. It doesn't offend them.
It's a if you know you know moment. You know, it's just
exactly.
kind of hanging out there, and the people that that are there for it get it and love it, and the other ones will just kind of be like, okay, what? And they just keep it moving.
Yeah, and those are the best things, like mashing up two things that shouldn't be together. And I constantly am jonesing and loving any sort of piece of content that takes like two things juxtaposed and finds a fun way to put them together. Like for instance, the other day I was watching the newest Bluey episode, and Bluey's like a BBC show. No, Australian.
Is this the sign? Is this that episode?
It is. But in the sign, which is the newest like Bluey episode, they make a reference to the mom and the mom's friend going on top of a hill and smoking weed when they're teenagers. But they don't say it like that, but they just like drop it in there to each other as a side eye. And of course it's for us, right? It's for us as parents. And it's hilarious. It makes it more relatable and just makes you feel seen. It makes you feel heard. And like, hey, they get me. Even though it's, just a kid's TV show in a way, like they get me. And it's like that sort of stuff. I'm like, it makes me feel happy and, like a warm hug in a way sometimes.
Well, yeah, I have some friends that they have young kids, and a lot of times we go visit them. Bluey is on, and they even sent me an episode one time. That where the parents are talking about having grown up in the '80s, and the kids are like, "What? You could do such and such." They go, it was the '80s, to the point where by the end of the episode, they'll hear something crazy and they'll just go, it was the '80s, and you can tell this is totally one just for the parents of all the kids who watch that show, who are like of a certain age, where you get like, it's like, we did this for you. We're it's like we see you, and we're showing you some love right now.
Yeah, I love those bits.
I feel like when we were kids, it was like TV shows would reference like, oh, it was the 60s, and like and now it's the 80s.
Yeah, exactly. 80s or 90s.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, to feel my age in a way. But.
Well, I know we're about to wrap up here, but any parting advice for any of our creatives out there who want to do more.
Well, first, I just want to say thank you to you two for having me on, to be honest, and reaching out. And I feel humbled and like honored to be on this. And it's cool to talk about being like the creative process internally and all that goes into it. And hearing the show before of like hearing other people's stuff, it's really inspiring and just kind of like reset yourself. So I appreciate having me on board for that.
Yeah, thank you.
So where can people find you online if they want to, at you or just learn more about all the cool random stuff you do?
Yes. Online, Instagram, I'm Jon B. Erwin, JonBerwin. It is a lot of kids stuff, but a little work sprinkled in there, but you can feel free to reach out or follow or DM, whatever that is. JonErwin.com, JonErwin.com is there. I'm also on LinkedIn the same way. There are two Jon Erwins in this space. One is a filmmaker who makes faith-based feature films. That's not me. I'm so often I tell people I'm the other Jon Erwin. But either one of those two, kind of like my main platforms, LinkedIn or Instagram, for sure. Advice though, I keep grinding, not to promote grind culture, hustle culture, because that's not my POV, but I mean more of like just don't get deterred, because like slow times will come and difficult times will come, and I've been laid off, and and projects have been really slow for months at a time at times, but trying to find your support network and your community of people that make you feel inspired and grounded to I think that to keep on going, I think it's the main thing, is what I tell people.
That will be all for this episode. To keep up with the show, follow us on social media at ScratchClawPush. If social media isn't your thing, you can contact us at scratchclawpush@gmail.com. To learn more about the show, visit scratchclawpush.com. This podcast has been a Carcutta Media production. This recording, or any portion thereof, may not be reproduced or used in any manner whatsoever without the express written permission of the publisher, except for the use of brief quotations in a review. Copyright 2024 by Carcutta Media, LLC, all rights reserved.